All right, welcome to the Return to Freud. This is the 25th workshop in the Return to Freud, where we are going to be covering a paper in this workshop from 1915 titled Instincts and Their Vicissitudes. So Instincts and Their Vicissitudes is a paper which is largely trying to develop the concept of instinct as it relates to psychoanalysis. As we often get into conversations about Lacan, this also has a deep relevance for how psychoanalysis comes to think about the term drive, and basically the relationship here between the mind and the body as conceptualized in psychoanalysis. So with that being said, I will pull up the screen. And start. So Instincts and Their Vicissitudes from 1915. This image here might be worth reflecting on just a moment to sort of capture what this paper is about. It's a striking image, and it's really a good way to think about the split subject. What it invokes for me is this idea of a one being split into two. And this one being split into two being sort of the emotional expressions there on the faces is expressions of contradictory emotions and emotions of both pleasure and pain, or joy and some sort of a negative affect. And I think that really captures a lot of what Freud's trying to express in this paper on instincts and their vicissitudes. Really, it's about the psyche and its relationship to the body, and the resulting contradictory emotions that emerge at that sort of split. So starting out, Freud makes a kind of meta-scientific point about how science does not begin with clear conceptualizations. It rather begins in describing, classifying, and correlating phenomena. This is a really important point because oftentimes when we go to university, we might get an education in physics, or we might get an education in whatever field. And we leave that education with a clear conceptualization, namely that we learn a certain language for thinking about a certain subject. But Freud's saying that that's not how sciences emerge and develop. That's not the genesis of a science. The beginning of a science is actually just simply observing phenomena, trying to describe it, trying to classify it, and it's messy. Like a birth, it's messy. So it only gains clarity in its conceptualization after the fact. So only after, he says, only after the investigation into the field of observation can we formulate basic concepts and confine definitions. And that's when we can teach a subject. But again, that's not how a subject is in its early days. And that's another reason why we're doing this Return to Freud, is that we are studying basically how psychoanalysis emerges as a new field of knowledge. And it's messy in the beginning, and then it gains its clarity as we move through. In this paper, he is looking at a basic concept that is obscure in psychoanalysis, or rather psychology, but he claims is indispensable, and that is the concept of instinct. So he's basically saying, okay, we have this concept instinct, which is indispensable but not very clear, and we are going to try to work through how we can make this concept clearer to our uses and for our purposes in psychology. So the instinct in physiology is defined as an internal stimulus or a need with a constant pressure on the mind where no flight is possible. Basically, what he's trying to do here is distinguish need or an internal pressure from a external one. namely that if there's some stimulus from the outside which is exerting a pressure on the mind, we can more easily avoid or withdraw from it. But when it comes to instinct, he says no flight is possible. And I just want to make a little note that I've just become aware of, that I didn't manage, or I forgot rather, to create images that correspond to the different slides in this presentation. That's a mistake on my part, but that's a drawback for this presentation. He then makes the distinction for the instinct in biology, that in biology, the instinct is a nervous substance, which is allowing for the first distinction or orientation between an inside and an outside. So when you combine the notion of the instinct in physiology and the instinct in biology, you get sort of a clearer understanding of what an instinct is in a way that's not necessarily connected to the mind. On the one hand, you have this pressure on the mind, and on the other hand, you have this first distinction or first orientation between an inside and an outside that's made possible by instinct. He then makes the point that nervous system is aiming to reduce external disturbances via withdrawal, but they cannot reduce internal disturbances when it comes to instinct, but rather must transform them. And this is really interesting when we think about Freud's emerging metapsychology as it relates to what will become beyond the pleasure principle. Because of course, Freud defines the pleasure principle as something that reduces excitation. And here he's saying that instincts cannot be reduced, but rather must be transformed. And that becomes basically a clue or an idea to the dimension of beyond the pleasure principle and ultimately the death drive, which is working with this type of inner force in the instinct, the mind working with an inner force which it has no choice but to tarry with and work with. So he says the conclusion here is that instincts are the true motive force behind developmental advances to present high levels. In other words, it is an illusion, and this is connected to the last presentation on Freud's thoughts on war, where Freud was very critical of our moral standards and our civilizational illusions, and civilization's lack of concern for the ground or the motive force of our instinctual drives. He's saying here that the instincts are the true motives behind our developmental advances, and that we have to work with them directly. And if we don't work with them directly, then we will find ourselves in situations not unlike the paradoxical situations of World War I, where a very civilization of a very high civilized morality starts to exhibit behavior that is of the most barbaric character, let's say. He says, no one really escapes this. Even the most highly advanced mental apparatus is still subject to the pleasure principle or this instinctual drive and is regulated by it. So it doesn't matter how intelligent you are. It doesn't matter how sophisticated you are in your language and your speech, your thinking, that this instinctual drive is alive and operative in everyone. And in that sense, is a sort of a universal effect on cognition. So basically here, when we think about what he's trying to say, we're talking about a process of mastering these instinctual stimulations. And this also points towards the concept of sublimation. The concept of sublimation is really about working with and transforming these very instinctual processes which we cannot escape and which we cannot avoid through our thinking or our abstraction. So again, as I sort of alluded to, Freud defines the pleasure principle as a decrease of stimuli or a decrease in excitation. The seeking of pleasure is a response to sort of a desire to decrease stimulation, whereas unpleasure is seen as an increase of stimulation or an increase of excitation. And again, here in this paper, we are not playing with the paradoxes of this relationship between pleasure and unpleasure, as sort of becomes more apparent in Freud's later work, specifically Beyond the Pleasure Principle. We have a weird inversion between pleasure and unpleasure, and also, as I'm sure will come up, also key to the Lacanian concept of jouissance, of pain and pleasure, and pleasure and pain. But the instinct is here, I think, and this is one of the most interesting distinctions Freud makes in the paper, which is that the instinct should be conceptualized not just as a somatic phenomena, as we were talking about in the first slides related to physiology and biology, but rather trying to bring it into the psychological domain, that the instinct is a concept that's useful to think about on the frontier between mind and body, as a psychological representative of a bodily demand on the mind. So I think the way he frames that is incredibly useful and interesting to think, because he's almost sort of suggesting that instinct is noumenal, that we can't really know what instinct is in itself, that we only know instinct as a psychological representation, that always already we are representing our instincts, that they have a phantasmatic and a symbolic dimension. And these are the way the mind is relating to its embodiment. I think that's very interesting to think about. So he then starts to offer 4 different categories, 4 different terms that we might use to think about the concept of instinct as it relates to this psychologization of instinct. Those 4 concepts include pressure, aim, object, and source. And we're going to go into those 4 different concepts now. So the first concept, pressure, he denotes as a motor factor or a force or measure of work. He, quote, a piece of activity. Here you can think about any of the bodily drives, whether, let's just go back to the basic drives in Freud. We have the oral, we have the anal, we have the genital. Later on, we could develop other drives, like related to the scopic or related to the also related to the voice. So these are different pressures or pieces of activity. Again, the body is fragmented between all of these drives. All of these are different pressures. Each of these pressures has a different aim, and that he says that you can learn about the aim of the pressure by removing the stimulation of source. We're going to get more into source later, but basically he's saying here that you need to sort of uncover or remove the source of an instinct in order to understand what its underlying aim is, and that all of them basically remain self-similar, that there can be different sources, but also ultimately the aim, all the paths have the same aim. He says the object of the instinct is the most variable, so the thing through which an instinct achieves its aim. And that here with object, the object category, we have the possibility of fixation. So in other words, the instinct is something inward, something inner. And of course, through the historical process, through the development of the organism, through the development of the subject, we can become fixated on different objects, which you might say become reified or reified by the subject. But he's saying here that this category here is the most variable of all the categories, namely that we can become fixated on many, many, many different objects. Finally, the source is the somatic process that occurs in an organ, a part of the body, as I referred to the Freudian drives here. Recall we have the oral, the anal, the genital, and I think later you can develop things like the scopic and the voice. But these are parts of the body. And again, these are parts of the body represented in mind by instinct. So in psychoanalysis, again, you never really are thinking about an instinct as purely biological or purely organismic. You're also always thinking about it as a living mind, the way, and also never just in a disembodied mind. We're thinking about a mind that's working with the body. So he says instincts are determined by their somatic source. Again, that's a part of the body. And the mental life only knows the somatic source by the aims. This is related to the idea that at least for humans, instincts, Freud's framing them in kind of a noumenal way, saying that we never know the instinct in itself, independent of our mind. We never know the instinct independent of our mental life. But we are only sort of here being in touch with the source through the aim of the source. So one of the assumptions is that instincts share a qualitative similarity of effect by excitation level or through external addiction. So again, through the organ by which an excitation level is possible. Or I think it's also important that he emphasizes this external dimension that we become addicted to certain substances. You can think about many different substances: alcohol, marijuana, different foods, harder drugs. These are external addictions, which are basically substitutions for instinctual excitations. And the psychoanalytic assumption here, and this is something that he's going to begin to problematize and has been problematizing more in recent papers, which is the assumption that you can group instincts between two different dimensions. The ego dimension, which is a self-preservative instinct, the dimension of the imaginary specular image of the ego, the I, the me. The ego as something that's trying to bring all of the fragmented drives of the body into a whole. And the sexual instincts, which he has said in many different papers, is some sort of quasi-immortal germplasm that is sort of using individuals or using egos to reproduce itself, to continue itself. And that, as we'll see in the next slide, that all of the psychological disorders of psychoanalysis, all of the neurotic and hysterical disorders, are basically a result of a friction or a tension between the ego of self-preservation and the sexual instincts on the other hand. So, like as I said, this hysteria and neurosis are the psychoanalytic sort of objects of investigation from the very first, from the beginning of the discipline. He is here consistent in continuing to classify these psychological disorders as transference neuroses, namely, as we've covered probably most extensively in the paper on narcissism. The transference neuroses are related to a problem of the object. You could say it's a problem of object fixation in the conflict between sexual and ego instincts, as I tried to explain on the previous slide there. However, the transference neuroses are getting sort of highlighted more and more in contradistinction to other neurotic affections, and this is again neurotic affections that he's only recently starting to talk about. I think most recently, again, I would point back to the workshop we did on narcissism, where he's focusing on quote unquote other neurotic affections, what he calls non-transference neuroses, namely not related to external object fixation, but where the object becomes internalized and there's no more distinction between the sex and the ego instincts, between narcissism and schizophrenias. And he says we may require a different formula to understand narcissism and schizophrenias. And this is also important here, new classification scheme in psychoanalysis, because it's at this level where Freud and Jung most clearly, I think at this point, start to part ways and start to think differently about psychoanalysis as it relates to these new neurotic affections. So as it relates to the ego-sex relations, and this is again back to the conflict between the ego and the sex drives, let's say. For the ego, the individual is the principal thing. The ego as the whole me, the ego as the unity, which is organizing all of the fragmentary drives. And the sexual drive, where the individual is merely a temporary appendage to a much larger process, namely the quasi-immortal germplasm that Freud is increasingly mentioning. So this tension here is really important to understand really what psychoanalysis is about in a meta-psychological point of view. So he says the principal knowing of the sexual instincts, again, where there's a distinction here between the sexual instincts and the ego instincts, is that the mental disturbances of the ego and the psychoneuroses of the ego are the only way in which we can understand the sexual instincts in themselves. Again, Freud is relating to the body and relating to the sexual instincts in a type of noumenal way, which I think is increasingly interesting to think about the more I talk about it. The sexual instincts, he claims, are capable of functions which are far removed from their original purpose. And this is the concept he terms sublimation. I've already mentioned sublimation earlier in the lecture. And that is basically, if you think about the original purpose of the sexual instincts, of course, that is, well, normatively to reproduce. But of course, in working with the body, in working with the sexual instincts, there's a possibility to transform that energy into something far removed from the reproductive function in the biological sense, which is what the ego is kind of struggling with. And in that foreshadowing of struggle, that's why he calls this paper the vicissitudes of instinct, specifically the vicissitudes of sexual instinct in their development. He mentions 4 different concepts now, but he will, in this paper, only get into 2 primarily. We'll get into very interestingly. The concept of reversal into opposite and turning round on subject. These are maybe weirdly phrased terms, but we'll see more clearly what he means by them in the coming slides. And he also mentions other vicissitudes of sexual instinct in repression and sublimation, which will be discussed in further papers, but not discussed here. So the reversal into opposite, what does this mean? Freud means this term to signify a change from activity to passivity and a change in content. Here, again, we're talking about sexual instinct. So when he goes into deeper classification of this, change from activity to passivity and change in content, he's referring to two pairs of opposites. The first is the opposite, sadism and masochism. Of course, sadism is when you derive pleasure from the other's pain, and masochism, where you derive pleasure from being the object of pain. Already we're getting a foreshadowing here of the weird inversion that's possible between pleasure and unpleasure in the original distinctions that Freud's setting out at the closer to the beginning of the paper. And Scopophilia and Exhibitionism, which is related to sadism and masochism, but there's more a dimension of the scopic drive, let's say. Remember, I was referring back to drives that appear at higher orders of the process of sublimation, one being the scopic drive, and that relates to scopophilia and exhibitionism. So to be, to look, to either, to be, sorry, to torture to look at, and to be tortured to be looked at. So it's basically this active passive distinction as it relates to looking and being looked at. And he claims that this has some relation to a reversal between love and hate, in basically loving related to the pleasure principle and hating related to unpleasure. And we're going to get a little more into the metaphysics of love and hate as Freud understands it towards the end of the paper. So scopophilia and exhibitionism specifically, he claims that, now you can also call scopophilia, I think its more commonly used term is voyeurism, to be a voyeur, to look at, and exhibitionism, to be looked at. He claims that these are the language of perversions, and looking at the object or being looked at has a certain developmental logic, because he claims looking precedes being looked at, namely you could say the scopophilic drive, enjoying looking, emerges before the exhibitionist drive, or being looked at. I think this is really interesting to think about in many different fields. I could apply it to myself right now, in fact. So for example, I enjoyed looking at other professors giving presentations, basically satisfying a scopophilic drive, I would say also related to voice, before I derive pleasure from being looked at, as I'm, as all of you are looking at me now, presumably, or I'm being looked at on YouTube. And I actually remember going through the process of this transformation. And I actually remember it being incredibly unpleasurable. I remember my first university presentation was unbearably unpleasurable. And the gaze of the other was terrifying and traumatizing, to be honest. In any case, scopophilia, or looking at, is autoerotic. So the object becomes a part of the subject's own body via comparison, is exchanged for. So for example, when I was watching university professors doing their presentations, I was getting an autoerotic excitation, let's say, or satisfying an autoerotic excitation, and also comparing myself to them as objects, basically seeing them as an extension of my own body. So the transformation from scopophilia to exhibitionism, basically an activity of looking to a passivity of being looked at, is one that can occur. Again, there's a developmental logic to it. And you can also think about this closer to sexuality itself, of course. And I'm just giving examples that are sublimated examples. So the preliminary stage is narcissistic, and this is increasingly clear in Freud's metapsychology, that he views narcissism as the foundation of the psyche, that we are in the beginning autoerotic. And that's what he's sort of making a close parallel. He doesn't necessarily distinguish too clearly between what is autoerotic and what is narcissistic. But looking at one's own body, becoming fascinated by one's own body, looking at it, becoming fascinated with the oral drive, becoming fascinated with the anal and the genital. And that scopophilia is a transition to the other. So it's basically like a relationship between the self and the other, where increasingly there's a developmental tendency towards the other. You could think about it as a transition from the one to the other in metaphysical terms. So passive scopophilia still holds to a narcissistic object in the other. But it's just, again, something that it's an imaginary object, a fantasy object that has become otherized, but it's still narcissistic, just in a new form. And he actually makes a structural comparison between scopophilia or voyeurism and exhibitionism to sadism and masochism, where I suppose scopophilia would be closest to sadism and exhibitionism might be closer to masochism. Not 100% sure on that one. Maybe we could talk about that one. The relationship between scopophilia, exhibitionism, and sadism and masochism. So the general realization is that the instinctual vicissitudes turned on the subject's own ego from active to passive. Basically, you could think about this perhaps in Lacanian terms as it relates to the ego's early fantasies of omnipotence, the child's fantasies of being omnipotent, all powerful, and gradually coming to the understanding that one is castrated, that you are impotent, and thus sort of giving up your narcissistic object and becoming sort of a more inclined to, let's say, transfer this object onto the other. So he then develops basically what he calls three antitheses for the governing of mental life by the instincts. These antitheses he sets up as subject-object or ego-world, which he says is primary. The others being pleasure-unpleasure, and the active-passive principle. Now, I wouldn't mind also discussing these three antitheses in great detail because they all seem to me to be quite primary. I'm not sure why one is more fundamental than the other. When we think about a child being born, it seems to me the subject object, the pleasure, the unpleasure, the active and the passive are all sort of operating. He distinguishes ego world from in and out stimuli, pleasure and unpleasure from scale of feelings, and active and passive to basically emotion, which will later refer to man and woman, or male and female, masculine and feminine. Now, all of these distinctions to me are connected. The in and the out stimuli to scale of feelings, as well as active and passivity. Thinking about them all as somehow interrelated. But then he starts to get into a metaphysics of love as something that's autoerotic, namely something that's related to the ego's own self-satisfaction, narcissistic tendency, to the pleasure that can become fixated on sexual objects and satisfying needs of sublimation. And it's in this move from the autoerotic fixation on the ego to becoming sublimated onto sexual objects to satisfy needs of sublimation, again, where all of the neurotic problems emerge for subjects where this split becomes perhaps unlivable. And for the other neurotic, not the neurotic, for the other psychological, the non-transference neuroses, what he's calling, it's kind of as though the love never moves from the ego and never becomes fixated on an object. Or at least this is much, much less strong, let's say. So the word love, he says, is most appropriate in relation between the ego and the object. So either something that becomes fixated on the outside, or like in the narcissist, where the ego and the object are one and the same, namely where you are the object. Your ego is your own object. And the word hate is most in connection between sexual pleasure, no connection between sexual pleasure and sexual function. Namely that there's a asymmetry or a discord or a friction between your libido and the object. So the relation of unpleasure, he says, is decisive here, where the ego hates and abhors, as well as pursues to destroy sources of unpleasure. Whereas the ego cultivates and loves sources of pleasure. And this relationship between pleasure and unpleasure becomes all paradoxical when we get into things like sadism and masochism and exhibition and voyeurism. And that's, again, just foreshadowing the metapsychological developments that are to come later in Freud. He says the genesis of love is the capacity of the ego to satisfy autoerotic instinctual impulses from organ pleasure. I've already talked about this, but it's, I think, important to reflect on. And it's, again, kind of the ground, the emerging ground in Freudian metapsychology is this narcissistic autoerotic instinctual impulse. And suppose it's already there in Freud's papers on the theories of sexuality. It's just becoming perhaps more well developed. And the crucial thing here is that Freud's thinking about libido in an autoerotic fixation is that's very different. I think it's a fundamental distinction to make the distinction between psychoanalysis as interested in focusing on the enjoyment of the subject as it relates to sexuality, and in an evolutionary or a Darwinian point of view, where sexuality is seen from more a functional or mechanistic point of view of reproduction. And there's a big distinction there between the evolutionary view and the psychoanalytic view. So hate in relation to objects, he says, is older than love. Namely, again, because of the primary narcissism. We are first have a relationship to external objects and the external world as through the mode of hate before we love it. He says there derives from a narcissistic ego a hatred of the world. I've definitely experienced that. There's some funny stories nearing the end, so maybe I share just a short story of I was extremely upset about a certain position I had in academia, and a professor told me to look how beautiful it is outside and to go and take a walk and look at the trees. And it just made me even angrier. Just had such a hatred of the world. And again, I think that's because there's a primary hatred about the otherness, a primary hatred about the object, the external world itself. And that's also one of the most interesting and enlightening things about the relationship between hate and love, which become highlighted in this paper, is that hate becomes mixed with love. And he says that this is derived from the original self-preservation instinct. And he makes the point that, for example, in a breakup, we can learn to hate the same person that we loved. And maybe that's the case for all romantic relationships, that we can have these paradoxical feelings of hatred and love swirling around in us. I've definitely had the experience of both hating someone I love and also being hated by someone who loves me. So it's and when I recall these experiences in my own life, they're extraordinarily powerful. Probably because you're being taken back to your primary or your original relationship to love and hate. So he says there's the possibility to move from loving some object outside. So again, you have first the love of the ego. You have the possibility to love something outside of yourself. But then you can move to the position of being loved. It's kind of like a dialectical triad or a dialectical trinity. Again, from loving the ego to loving an object outside of yourself to being the object of love. And he says this corresponds to activity and passivity, similar to scopophilia and sadism. So he is linking scopophilia and sadism. And I suppose then by extension, exhibitionism and masochism. I wonder what that means about me. So the essential feature of instinctual vicissitudes is that they, and this is a summary basically, is that they influence three great polarities on the mind. Again, we went through those, and he makes distinctions here that I'm going to take some liberties of saying that they are quasi-Lacanian, where he puts the active and passive polarity on the level of biology, basic movement of instinct, let's say, activity, passivity. The ego world as the real, let's say that's the reality principle, is the gap between ego and world. Like when the professor said, go and take a walk and look at how beautiful it is outside. And the real for me was just pure hatred. And then pleasure and unpleasure, being kind of like an economic level. Again, I'm going to take some liberties here and say that these are quasi Lacanian ways of thinking, and I will here just present a little image that I created, that I was inspired to create from going through this paper, of a triad between these three polarities. Again, Freud puts activity, passivity on the biological, ego world on the real, pleasure, unpleasure on the economic. And he says that, this is to summarize the paper, Instinctual Vicissitudes, as kind of like the libido as instinct, splitting into these polarities, one dividing into two, here manifesting these triads. And just a further here liberty I'm going to take here is linking them to the imaginary, symbolic, and the real, where I'm saying the biology might be thought of as imaginary. And again, that's interesting because in this paper, Freud is thinking about the instincts in the body as kind of in a noumenal way, And in that sense, it makes sense to think of them as imaginary, I think. Now, to classify pleasure unpleasure as symbolic is sort of taking liberties of transforming the category economic into the category symbolic as kind of like the way in which there's an economy, a libidinal economy of pleasure and unpleasure. And finally, the distinction of the real, perhaps where the ego and the world are in this relationship between love and hate. Anyway, I thought that might be interesting to think. And thank you all for listening. I'm going to close my screen. And feel free to jump in and let's talk about it.
I'll get the ball rolling. Thank you, Cadell, for an excellent presentation. This is such a seminal paper that one of Freud's most important, probably, because it reaches back and links together so many philosophical strains and reaches forward into these Lacanian ideas that you've already talked about. Of course, we can't really talk about the instincts or drive without referencing Lacan's, especially Seminar 11. But what I want to do, and I'll leave some of the other philosophical connections to everyone else, but I would kind of want to think about this in a little bit of a Hegelian and Schellingian way. One of the Hegelian ideas that I wanted to explore is just in the notion that Freud himself uses the term, and Lacan develops it a bit more, as this notion of the drive as a Grundbegriff, a fundamental concept, or a ground concept. And if we think about the notion of a begriff, a concept in the Hegelian sense, the concept or notion has a kind of autonomous movement. And so I think when we're thinking about a concept, we're already in this notion of an autonomous thing that moves of its own, and that it is a fundamental or ground concept means that it doesn't have a prior cause necessarily, so it lies at the very root of psychical life. Now, what's interesting now in that context is I don't think that Hegel is really capable of thinking in terms of drive. I think maybe the closest he really gets to is the unhappy consciousness, self-consciousness, the unglückliche Selbstbewusstsein, but what he does here is make a very important point, is that in the unhappy self-consciousness, there is an immediate identification of spirit with thinghood, Dingheit, where the I, the self-consciousness, is identified as also a thing in the world. And so then going into the section on the Phenomenology of Spirit on observing reason, Hegel makes this very interesting observation regarding phrenology, where he says that phrenology comes to this contradiction that spirit is a bone. The being of spirit is a bone. And here we come to this same idea that spirit is a thing. And I think this is perhaps the closest that Hegel is able to get in coming close to this notion of the drive, is that there is something about spirit, there's something about our psychical life that is its own thing, that moves autonomously in and of itself, that is often contrary to our our self-conscious knowing I. But I think it's Schelling who is who better able to think in terms of drive. In his the three drafts that we have of his Ages of the World, he conceives of the birth of the divine being in terms of two opposing drives that operate in a rotary motion, that are locked into a kind of struggle against themselves. And there is an initial will or drive that is an expansionary force, which we can, I think, equate with this notion of a life drive or an ego drive in Freud. And then there is a contracting force that sort of solidifies and brings cohesion. And this, I think, we can also relate to the notion of a death drive, or also the primary and secondary processes. These are very similar concepts. And so it is, I think it's Lacan who is able to then, not necessarily directly from Schelling, but is able to take the Freudian notion of the drive in a very Schellingian way. In Seminar 2, Lacan understands and of course we can't think about Freud and the drive without thinking about beyond the pleasure principle and the life drive and death drive. He thinks of the life drive in terms of cathexis, the primary process, and the death drive in terms of the secondary process, which he then equates with the imaginary and the symbolic, respectively, where the imaginary is the cathexis, the primary process. The symbolic is the dead letter that is the death drive. It brings cohesion and solidity, a ground to the subject. And so what Lacan does by unifying the drive, not in terms of necessarily a single drive in Seminar 2, but in this play of opposites that is itself a unity, which he develops more fully in Seminar 11. So this is, I think, the very interesting notion here, particularly that Schelling, I think, was able to develop, is the polarity of the drive that has its own inner struggle and rotary motion, and that this becomes the very ground of development of the divine being. That it is in this rotary motion of the drives where God is able to essentially step out and become a distinct being, and that this is essentially what we have, in I think Freud's notion here of the drive, sublimation, and all of that sort of thing. So I'll end with that and let anyone comment. Thank you, Cadell.
Thanks for making the connection to Hegel here. That's great. And if I may continue here, if Cadell doesn't have something important to say right now.
Well, I do have one thing to say. I couldn't find the exact line, unfortunately. But if people are interested in any case, Zizek's argument about Hegel's capacity to think the drive, it's in a subsection of Less Than Nothing titled From Repetition to Drive, where, if I remember correctly, he suggests that the way Hegel talks about the idea in the last pages of Science of Logic is evidence that he could think the drive, but I'll leave that for future philosophical debates.
Yeah.
Go for it, Mika.
Yeah, so thanks for the presentation and everything, but here I would like to also note that the very theory of drives in psychoanalysis is probably the most contested part of Freud's whole edifice, even. And it has become like the, perhaps for more like one could say scientifically oriented psychologists, the kind of like main thing to repudiate even, and a source of aversion for even for psychoanalysts. There are many reasons for why they think that this doesn't work, Freud's economic model and everything. But then I would like to also be able to make really clear, or maybe we can progress towards this together. How does Freud take the starting point of drives here? What's really his basis and everything? So what's his evidence here, and what type of progress of speculation does he employ here, really? He makes a passing comment that there might be some type of like differing qualities for different drives, and he in a really subtle way says that there might be really great many variety of drives, like play drives and drives related to, I don't know, all sorts of things. But what he tries to do is to just reduce them to most primitive forms. And he also takes psychoneurosis as the kind of ground, privileges even neurosis for the study of the drive. So there's a lot of things that he leaves sort of like outside the purview of this very study. But when he focuses on the ego and the sexual drives, it's still an open question. Why does he really focus on these two? It's almost seeming like some kind of primitive duad that he uses. But I don't think that he really ignores the possibility that there are innumerable different ways that drives can manifest in our lives. He just wants to reduce them to two primitive groups. He says that there are two groups of drives. And also I would like to discuss why does he think that love is originally narcissistic? And what really is the concept of original narcissism in Freud? I mean, it's not some kind of like noumenal thing. He does give some kind of like developmental view for why does he think that there is such a thing even. I also, in connection to Hegel, I was reminded just that Hegel makes a comment in passing in Phenomenology of Spirit, where he is opening the discussion about self-actualizing spirit or self-actualizing rationality. He makes the point that sounds very Freudian, that in our development, we need to somehow cultivate our natural needs to fit into some kind of culture. And these needs or natural drives, Hegel says, must be somehow, as I said, they must be sort of like cultured, brought into the alienating sphere of culture. And this is a huge problem for Hegel, which really opens up the whole issue of what does the rationality that tries to self-actualize try to do. This need for incorporating drives into culture creates a distinction between our innermost certainty of ourselves and truth. And truth is for Hegel something that must be attained. It's not there at the beginning. Something that I was just reminded, and the whole discussion about the domain of the law and culture, it's really Freudian, I think.
And there's lots of themes there that we can play with. I'm just wondering if one of the things that sticks out to me the most is trying to think this concept of love that Freud's developing as a part of his metapsychology. But Chitin, did you want to raise a separate issue, or you
No,
have your
I
hand?
just wanted to respond to Eric and Mika actually.
Oh,
On
go
the
for it then. Yeah.
Hegel and Drive bit in that sense. Quickly, I'll just
Go for it. No, take your time.
Actually, I just wanted to say that at one point, at least when I read Hegel, Hegel and Freud resonate to me in the sense that Hegel can think movement. And I think that is where Hegel's question of drive and Freud's question of drive and Hegel find an affinity in that sense. If you look at Newton, what did Newton do? What did the post-Newton universe was? That Newton displaced this idea that there is something called static and something moving at different things. Whatever is at rest will remain at rest. Whatever is moving will remain moving. That's a Newtonian, that's a post-Newtonian world that never existed pre-Newtonian. That things can be constantly in movement, and yet they can have, they may not be any external force acting upon them, as very rightly Eric said, that you can have they don't have to be a pre-cause to that movement in that sense. That post-Newtonian world got affirmed from Kant to Hegel, and it ended in Hegel, where, as Mika rightly said, there's a question of self-actualization coming to the center, where Hegel is not putting his philosophy as other to other philosophy systems. In fact, he's saying that a movement exists right within any philosophical system itself. Any philosophical system tumbles through its own negation and moves forward from there, and so on and so forth. And that is how he's within the Phenomenology of Spirit. Each section is actually responding to one philosophical thesis, and he finds its own gap from within the thesis, not by bringing his own system from the outside, but by just developing that thesis, whatever is inside, bringing it to the surface. Once it comes to the surface, it finds its own contradiction, and movement forward from there, in that sense, takes place. It is in that sense that Hegel can think about drive, because to me, drive is not this distinction between life and that drive in that sense, which is for Freud also in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Drives get reduced to that drive in some sense. He doesn't think of it in terms of two. Two comes later, in that sense. So I think that is where the affinity would lie. I think that's what even Mika was, I think, trying to hint at.
Okay, let me answer that with something that I was going to say, and I'd forgotten. And this jogged my memory. In that respect, what I think Schelling has an answer to that. In the first draft of Ages of the World, Schelling criticizes Hegel's dialectic, and saying that what the dialectic does is like you said, it's constantly moving, it's constantly sublimating, and precisely what the dialectic is incapable of doing is sticking with the middle. It's always in one extreme or the other, right? It's always negating. And so can we not see drive not as this constant motion of the dialectic, but a stagnation of the dialectic, the actual middle? And so that it's this inner motion within the middle, and that's where the drive is located, and that's where Schelling says there's a lot of important things that go on in the middle that Hegel is unable to see. So I think you're right, but I think we have to see in the drive not a dialectical sublation, because the drive always returns to its origin. It's this rotary motion that Lacan brings out so well, and so it's precisely in this middle where I think we have to locate it.
Eric, I agree with you actually, but what you need to think about the middle is you need to think about the heterogeneous in that sense. And Zizek sort of critiques Hegel in that. One of the criticisms of Zizek of Hegel is that Hegel cannot think in some senses this issue of contradictory things being placed together. In Hegel, there has to be an end result. There has to be resolution taking place in that sense. In Freud, that resolution doesn't always come. Things can be messy. Things can go from here to there. In that, And I remember Foucault writing in one of his Birth of Biopolitics lectures, and he sort of reiterates Zizek only. He says that Hegel dialectic cannot think the heterogeneous. Hegel dialectic actually works in homogeneous mediums, as you rightly said. It can't think the middle. So to that degree, I agree with you that Hegel can't think drives in that sense. But what he can think is the movement.
Yeah, and also in this sense, I think that the point that Zizek makes also in the ticklish subject, it's that Hegel is not some type of like semantic idealist. for Zizek, Hegel was aware that the domain of meaning can never achieve some type of total closure and ground itself somehow in a self-referential way, but has to rely on the notion of indivisible remainder for Hegel. And that's the notion that there is some type of like surplus enjoyment provided by blind mechanistical exercise. So in connection to self-actualizing spirits, there's this idea that self-discipline is sustained only by some type of surplus enjoyment that's produced by it.
I just want to say, because the topics has structured most of the discussion, that there's a chapter in Less Than Nothing that's titled The Limits of Hegel. I think it's called Chapter 7, or it's Chapter 7, sorry. And there's a line from Zizek that I think might be interesting to repeat here that is relevant. He said, quote, "One should be very precise about what Hegel cannot do. It is never a question of simple impossibility or inability. There is, in all these cases, a tiny, imperceptible line of separation which compels us to supplement the assertion of impossibility with a qualifying yes, but." So, and that's end quote. So I think when, like we say, for example, Hegel can't think the middle, or Hegel's stuck in dialectical opposites and he can't think the drive, I do think that what Zizek's saying here is we have to supplement it with a yes, but. Because, like, for example, I want to just give the example from my personal reading of Hegel, because one, I've only read in great detail the Phenomenology of Spirit, and I've yet to approach the monster that is Science of Logic, for example, but I hope to. And even in reading the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is really his first work, the point of the book is really to take you through this adventure, this thought adventure, which is dialectical in nature. But I think he's pretty clear that absolute knowledge as such is much more like a drive. But the point of Phenomenology of Spirit is not to really go into the nature of the drive. So I wonder if the dialectic of spirits coming to understand itself is more like desire, more has the structure of desire, but that absolute knowledge is more like the structure of drive. I don't know if any of you guys have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And that's why I said I think the closest he comes maybe in the phenomenology is in the unhappy consciousness, precisely where he locates spirit with thinghood. And that is something that I think carries into the absolute. That's the gap or the contradiction that doesn't ever really get resolved. And that's the real essence of Hegel's idealism, if we could call it idealism, or an idealized materialism, a materialized idealism. It is that bone that's always there. Substance is also subject, you know. So yeah, I think that's very good.
Certainly Freud is messier. Were there any reflections that are we're taking this deep into philosophical territory? Is there anything that's coming up for people that's maybe more related to this paper on instincts and mind? Although I do think thinking about desire and drive is here very relevant.
Can I maybe expand on the topic of or the distinction between a human desire and drive in how
Yes.
Zizek interprets Lacan here. So the basic point for Zizek is that human desire is in Lacanian way always and constitutively mediated by a reference to nothingness. So the true object cause of desire is, as Zizek says, always a sort of a metonymy of a lack, a stand-in for just nothingness. And here one can think of the problem of like being stubbornly attached to something. So here one can think that the wanting to attach to certain object, think about like addiction for cigarettes, for example. One could also think about maybe anorexia or certain difficult like psychological issues and so on. That in this stubborn attachment to something, what we really want is the nothingness, or we are really attached in there to nothingness of our own being. And excess and lack of attachment thus coincide, since excessive attachment to a particular contingent object is the very operator of this lethal disattachment, to quote Zizek. And so Zizek says that we pass from instincts. I mean, in the basic Freudian idea is that the type of like biological instinct which which you were saying is some kind of like noumenal biological basis. The basic idea is that in Freud, instinct becomes a drive when it works over by the psyche. And Zizek explains how we pass from instinct to drive when instead of aiming directly at some goal that would satisfy us, bring satisfaction, the satisfaction is then brought just by circulating around the void, by repeatedly missing the object, which is the stand-in for the central void. So this is the kind of like dialectic of desire and drive that Zizek gives from Lacan. And to give a short quote here also, so when a subject desires a series of positive objects, think about like cigarettes and alcohol and so on, the thing to do is to distinguish between the objects which are actually desired as particular object and the object which is desired as the stand-in for nothingness, which functions as a negative magnitude in the Kantian sense of the term. So the notion of the object is really, I think, crucial to discuss also here, since, well, what really distinguishes Lacanian theory in 50s onwards is his understanding of the object, which is directly related to our current reading.
Absolutely. I'm just, there's so many. Does anyone have anything they want to respond to there? Because otherwise I've got.
Yeah, I would like to. And I think Lacan does such a wonderful job of bringing this all together in his little diagram that kind of looks like a nipple in Seminar 11, where he brings these four terms, or really there's two of importance that Freud brings out: the Drang, the pressure, and the Ziel, or aim. And we can see how the aim is precisely this satisfaction, is what Freud says. But what is satisfaction in the Freudian sense? It's a reduction of stimulus, right? Or a nothingness. And so Lacan locates the Ziel, at the apex of this return. But what I find so interesting about Lacan's diagram, and it took me a long time to really get it, understand it, is this loop that goes around it, and it's the rim of the drive. which we have to associate with the object, as Mika mentioned. We need to pay attention to this object, because what the object does here, this rim, all of the surfaces of the erogenous zones, is it provides a kind of constriction, a kind of tension that is able to sustain the drive. And I'm not really sure where to take that, but I think just to try to take what Mika was talking about a little further, is to point out those coordinates that Freud gives and Lacan, I think, makes a little clearer. And that is precisely this. What is the aim of the drive? Well, it's getting back to a nothing, only so that it can keep going.
Yeah. So
that very tension that keeps it going is this rim, this object of the erogenous zones itself, which is, I think, something we could say it's something in the not so much in the real, but in the imaginary body. So that, I mean, that's something that Cadell, you brought up at the very end, that I think it deserves to be thought about, is this connection between the body and the imaginary. Because in Lacan, from the mirror stage on, the body is not necessarily the real, it's the imaginary.
Yeah, it's such an interesting flip.
Yeah.
I love thinking about the body, that the body and the instinct are actually best thought about as imaginary. I'm having something interesting come up for me. It's not super well organized, but it is directly related to what Mika and Eric were talking about. Like, if we think about in this paper, I think Freud made it clear, like, that the object of the instinct is the most variable, and that object fixation is what leads to the transference neuroses, and that the object, as Mika's mentioning, the object is a stand-in for nothingness. So all of the different objects that we get fixated onto positively are going to fail, and that's what we call the neuroses. And then we have to learn to love nothingness itself, and that all of the other objects are kind of just stand-ins. We gave the example of cigarettes. Now, the paradox that I noticed in myself, I'm trying to reflect on in myself, is that there's a email group called the Intellectual Deep Web where, well, I'm active in it, and I always emphasize death. You know, I'm emphasizing nothingness. So I'll repeat that signifier. Now, I notice all the other people in the listserv, they also have signifiers which they'll repeat. So, like, someone might repeat, you know, X philosopher, always repeating the same philosopher over and over again. Where I'm repeating death, and then now, but even when I'm repeating death or repeating nothingness as a signifier, I'm still positivizing it because I'm signifying it. So isn't it that if I'm questioning myself deeply, I need to even overcome the signification of it? This is what I'm trying to think. That it's a paradox in myself that I even signified. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just overthinking it.
It's a great point. I love the reference here to these issues, but really I would like to return to appreciating the way that Lacan in Seminar 4, which is on the object relation as a whole, how he in there really shows that there is this type of like paradox within the sexual object itself. And the point of departure for Lacan is that in the 50s, the psychoanalytic community had, for him, regressed to a kind of a harmonic notion of the object, presupposing some type of pre-established harmony between the subject and the object. And this is, for Lacan, something that is absolutely against everything that psychoanalysis has found. And Lacan actually quotes Freud's words from drives and their fates, that the object of the drive is that through which the drive is able to achieve its aim. It is the most variable aspect of the drive, not originally connected with it, but merely appropriated by it on grounds of suitability to provide satisfaction. So the object can be pretty much anything, and the idea of an object as just some type of like concrete object must be jettisoned here to understand what is meant by the object here. It's not just an object, it's that which just gives satisfaction to the drive. It's a matter of satisfaction in so much as the position that the pleasure principle takes as the goal of the drive tendency is that of arriving at its own satisfaction. So the notion that there is no preset harmony between the object and the drive tendency is spelled out, Lacan says there. And he points out that for Freud, the finding of an object is always based on primary finding. This means that the Wiederfindung, refinding, is never satisfactory. And this is partially the reason for why in psychoanalytic community, from then on, it's really fashionable to talk frustration. And what's frustration really? That's what Lacan takes as a really key issue, but he spells out it in such an elegant way that it leaves the whole mystifying tendencies within psychoanalytic community behind. For Lacan, there are three relations to the object, which all are the lack of object. There is frustration, which for Lacan is just, as he says, imaginary detriment. It's something that demands for reprimation, So, and the other relations are castration and privation. Castration is obviously symbolic and privation is real. And something that I think I might have to substantiate here is that I earlier referred to anorexia as a problem. So the kind of problem that somebody in psychology might have, or psychiatry, is that why is the anorexic person really troubled by eating? So they are asking the question in the way that why doesn't the subject conform to some type of pre-established way of relating to the food object? And the way that they think is that the anorexic person doesn't want to eat anything. The person has a relation object that he or she just doesn't want to eat the thing. But what Lacan enables to see is that the anorexic person really does eat, but what he or she eats is the nothingness. Yeah.
If I may, I want to take a cue from Chetan in the chat. Says, let's talk about the objet A. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the objet A, because what I find interesting is that even though Lacan talks about the drive as one of the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, he doesn't talk about drive much at all in his later seminar. In the last decade of his life, it's really not there. But what is there, running throughout, is the objet A. And in the sense that, I mean, that's one of the constants in his thought. And so what happens to the drive for Lacan? And I think it has something to do with something that Zizek says, and I don't know where, but I've heard him or read him say this, that there really isn't so much this hard and fast distinction between drive and desire, but that drive is the very contour of desire. In other words, we have to think about it, I think, like gravity, where instead of thinking about gravity as a force in a Newtonian sense, in an Einsteinian sense of relativity, gravity is the very shape of space-time, very curvature of space-time, right? And so drive isn't a force. It isn't a separate thing. It's the very curvature of psychical life, such that it's, even though Lacan doesn't talk about it in his later seminars, it's nevertheless there. And that curvature of psychical life is the objet. Because if you look at the way he describes the Borromean knot, especially in Seminar 22, RSE, where does he locate the objet? At the very center of the knot, where the rings of the imaginary, symbolic, and the real all overlap. In other words, there is something, we can't locate the drive necessarily in either one of those orders, but where they all converge in this singularity, this black hole that provides this inner curvature that rotates the knot. In Seminar 21, he talks about the rotation of the Borromean knot. And I think we can maybe even see that something as drive, as you can think about the way that the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real relate to each other and fall into each other. You can talk about, for example, realizing the symbolic of the imaginary, or imagining the symbolic of the real. And he does this a little bit in Seminar 21, and it's very interesting to kind of think about. And this is its own kind of rotary motion that is centered around, at the very center of the knot, is the objet. And so I think for Lacan, what he ends up doing, even though he doesn't talk about drive very much, is it does become very central, in the sense that it becomes this very curvature of the space-time of psychical life. And that singularity that gives it structure is precisely this nothingness, this lost, missing object, the objet.
Can I quickly respond?
Please do.
Yeah. So I was just, brilliantly put it in that sense that, object I is actually the object called the desire, not the object called the drive in that sense. If you think about it, object I is the point from which the drive itself finds its curvature into a desire. In that way, desire is always, in some senses, intertwined with that, with the drive. And drive is always sort of located in that curvature. It's never there independently, separately visible. And I remember Ladin-Dolar actually saying it somewhere that, with Hegel, we had a theory of the subject. What Lacan brought to it was not this great new subjectivity or something like that. What Lacan brought is the theory of the object in some senses. He starts to think about objects seriously, which is not even there in Freud and Hegel till that point. If you think about object seriously in that sense, we need to start asking the question, in what way, when we talk about nothingness, that is what I was trying to think about in the chat also. And when we think about drive sort of not reaching its goal, circulating it around itself, it never gets full satisfaction in that sense. In many ways, object of course represents that nothingness, but object is also the access to that nothingness to the extent that it is a necessary counterpoint to the drive, through which we can actually find a movement forward, a certain kind of satisfaction possible. The object is not something which is meaningless in Lacan in that sense. Object has a very, very specific space through which the psychical movement becomes possible. And how do we think through that? And this question of satisfaction and pleasure also remains like, I think, Eric, you said that when we think about satisfaction in that sense, satisfaction is decrease in stimulus. Satisfaction also actually corresponds to more so, in my view, to your ability to hold attention as a subject. If you can decrease the stimulus through many various pleasure mechanisms. For satisfaction, you need to be able to hold attention also in your own self. If you can't hold attention, you'll not be in that sense satisfied. So how do we? And I think there's something to be said about thinking through that question of drive slipping into desire through this question of objecta, where it's never we can say nothingness, but it's never completely nothingness. There's always access to it through which we find meaning and so on and so forth. In that movement,
I just want to say on that point, like just to echo your point that lack or nothingness in Lacan especially is always excess too. Lack and excess are there's a dialectic between lack and excess, and that's what I noticed in my own little philosophy series on the philosophy of lack, is that I started that series with the question of the feeling of something missing, this lack. But then by the third part of the series, I realized we had to talk about excess. So the lack always already turned into an excess. So that's interesting to think. But I also want to emphasize Eric's point about the objet the drive rather as the curvature of psychical life. I think that's a really interesting metaphor to think about that. And actually, if anyone listening is interested, there's a paper by Zizek called Lacan as a Reader of Alien. If you just Google Lacan as a Reader of Alien on Lacan.com, the Zizek has some nice lines about that metaphor of gravity and curvature and so forth. But yeah. Wondering, Evren or Jayati, are there any thoughts buzzing around in your heads? Is there anything that came up for you in this talk?
But it's on a different tangent, not in continuity with what was being discussed. So I found it a very tough paper, by the way, and I don't even think I followed everything. But what I was wondering after reading it is this entire sadism and masochism. And I found the structure being parallel with what Nietzsche has been talking about when he talks about suffering, and he talks about to suffer is how to suffer is nice. To see others suffer does one good, and to make others suffer even more, to make others suffer is almost like a genuine festival. Also, second parallel that I found was in Civilization. I think Freud is talking about this aggressive instinct which is directed towards the other, but because of the civilizational pressure, it gets turned inside, which he then is talking about as guilt and all of that. And Nietzsche is also talking about guilt in the same sense, but where I found that the structure loses the similarity, and where Freud I find him complicating this further through identification and all of it. So Nietzsche gets into this active and reactive man. I don't want to go to that. I'm not pointing the temporality of it, but if you look at it in terms of a slightly evolutionary sense, Freud then is more, I found Freud then is more worrying about or really delving about this, the present man and the present human being and what is it that is going through. And then there is a difference that one can see over here, because I don't find active man in Freud. On the contrary, he's getting into the details of the reactive man and resentment. And why I'm saying that, because at least in Nietzsche, my reading would be that this active man can be unabashedly sadist. One doesn't have to really hide it or put any have any qualms about it. But over here, the way Freud is laying down this entire story in this particular story, and I quite agree. When I thought of my friends and myself, I do agree with what he's talking about, this sadism, that whenever we are looking at sadism, how it is essentially masochism. Isn't that guilt? isn't that reactive man only? Isn't that a certain form of resentment only, which Nietzsche has been talking about when he was talking about reactive man?
Well, this is very interesting. I like this is bringing up some things that are really on the edge of my mind right now, because there's a few people I'm talking to about René Girard. I know René Girard is coming up more and more in conversations, and I'm more and more pressed to read Girard because it's just coming up so much. But what I want to highlight here in what you were saying is this aggressive, hopefully it approaches your question or approaches what you're wrestling with here. So you have this aggressive instinct on the other, which because of civilizational pressures gets pushed on the inside. And I think that the way I'm relating to that is that the aggressive instinct on the other is what Girard's calling the scapegoating mechanism, where there's a mob that tries to kill someone to pacify their own rage in the group. And then then at least in Girard's narrative argument, Christianity comes along and turns that aggressive instinct inwards. So you have the symbol of Jesus who sacrifices himself for the collective. And then we had, okay, well, we've got Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice. We sacrificed God. So now we can stop trying to scapegoat other people and basically turn everything inwards. And then you have Nietzsche come along who says, you guys are all a bunch of hypocrites. And, you know, you guys aren't really in touch with your basic aggressive instinct, right? Like Nietzsche's basically saying, you guys aren't in touch. You guys aren't actually thinking what you are. And you guys are all just acting out of guilt and shame, and you're drenched in all this guilt and shame, and you have this image of Jesus, and you just, so I don't know if this points in a helpful way to maybe you want to, I don't know, play off of that, but I'm thinking about this. I'm not sure how to approach this weird mechanism.
I think if I quickly make a point, Edwin, you want to go first? Please go ahead.
You go ahead because I'm going to talk about object A. So let me not interrupt. I go later.
Everin, I need you to be more aggressive. I need you to just say, Chitan, stop talking. It's my turn to talk. No, I'm just, go ahead, Chitan.
Go ahead, Edwin. Good. Yeah.
Okay.
You're muted there, Everin.
Okay, I would like to provide two different definitions of object A made by two Lacanian scholars, one by McGowan. This is how Todd McGowan describes object A. He says the subject is incomplete or lacking because it doesn't have this object, though the object only exists insofar as it is missing. And Zizek, according to Zizek, object A is not the object to be castrated. It is rather an object which emerges as the remainder of the very operation of castration, an object which fills in the lack opened by the castration, an object which is nothing but this lack itself acquiring a positive form. And regarding what Eric said about the thing, das thing, this is what I am wondering actually, because if the thing is the pre-social, pre-linguistic enjoyment that we get, isn't it what Lacan calls jouissance? So I think in that sense, das Ding, the thing, is the same thing as what Lacan says jouissance, if it is the enjoyment that we get before the language. I mean, do you agree, or I don't know?
Well, when I was thinking about thing, I was speaking about it in a Hegelian sense, which is more like just a real object, not in the Freudian Lacanian sense of das Ding. Although I've wanted to draw a connection to that, and that's still kind of in the back of my mind. The notion of das Ding is in Lacan is very difficult. Richard Boothby is the one that I think has done the most work in that, and I need to go back and reread that. So I feel kind of a little unprepared to be able to speak definitively about the notion there of das Ding, but jouissance is, and again, the jouissance has many different valences, and there's something about, and a jouissance is related to drive, obviously, because it is, we could even say it's the very effect of the drive. It is the dissatisfaction of the drive. And that's why I in the configuration of the Borromean knot, in the center is the objet A, and in the other overlaps of the rings on going around are the various types of jouissance: phallic jouissance, jouissance of the other, and jouissance or jouissant. And so you can see how there's this kind of rotary motion of the knot and the different jouissance that turn around the objet A. But what is jouissance in its legal definition? It is usufruct. It's the use of something, right? It is your enjoyment of someone else's property. And that is the essence of jouissance for Lacan. Is the jouissance comes from the big other, and it's something you use and enjoy that is from the other. And that's, I think, something critical about drive that we haven't really talked about, even when we were talking about the object of the drive and the objet A, is that the objet A is a figuration of the big other, right? It's the breast, it's the voice, it's the gaze. Those are the figurations of the objet A. And I think we shouldn't miss that precise point that what we are enjoying in the drive is this something that's left over from the big other. And then there is, of course, this notion of the surplus jouissance, which is this this object that we or some aspect of the objet A that we cede, that we give back to the big other in order to have this jouissance of the signifier. Now, I think das Ding is kind of it's something behind all of that is giving the motion to all of it. It stands a little bit behind the objet A in a sense. It's difficult to speak about, and I would like to be able to speak about it better, but I don't know if I can. But I hope that I've at least maybe brought a little bit more clarity to that.
I was also thinking that when we discuss jouissance, we must take into account the fact that what is of stake if we read Daniel Leader and his groundbreaking new book on jouissance or essay, is that what really motivates the discussion of jouissance is the strange satisfaction, Freud says, that the neurotic gets from the symptom. And what's at issue in psychoanalysis is really symptomatic enjoyment, the type of enjoyment that a neurotic can get from some fixation on an object and even a self-repudiation in the process. And if we exclude this reference to the big other in jouissance, as for example, thinking of it as some kind of enjoyment that is prior to language and then needs to be somehow let go when coming into symbolic context, I think it's a really non-helpful way. And I think it's keeping with the recent argument that Leader gives, that maybe jouissance would even be best thought of as some kind of the others, the big others, mortgage on the subject. And a relation where the subject is being abolished or not recognized as a subject. And yeah, this would really need to be connected also with the discussion about autoerotism, which I think has been somehow ignored during this whole discussion even. Should I go on? Or maybe
Well,
Alexander has something to say about jouissance.
Well, I would just, unless Alexander has something directly to say, we can get to Alexander next. I guess if you want to stay on this topic of autoeroticism, we can for a moment. I mean, the way I think about it, or the way I'm just would spontaneously try to think about it, is especially in the way Freud's framing himself in the last few papers. It's almost like the autoeroticism is that the subject is already its object of desire in the beginning. It's like the subject is its own object of enjoyment, and it doesn't need, or like maybe even if you take it back to the womb itself, I'm always tempted to take it back to the womb itself.
Yeah, but that's where I'm really critical, since that's not what Freud gives. That's not what he says.
No. I'm just trying to think here.
Autoeroticism, it's not a primary structure for Freud. It belongs to the early stage of ego. I would like to maybe quote Freud in saying that if an object is subsequently something that proves to be a source of pleasure, it is loved, but it is also incorporated into the ego. So this is the type of like structuration of the primary narcissistic stage. And Freud thinks that this is the stage where hate as a phenomenon, and as you said, as a metaphysical, but I would say maybe meta-psychological way of how Freud thinks that hate itself is brought about. It's when the object, he says that hate is more primary than love.
Mika,
he has an argument for this view.
Mika, just a clarification. Are you saying that drives are not autoerotic at their origin?
What?
Are you saying that drives are not autoerotic at their origin?
That drives are not autoerotic at their origin.
Are you making that claim?
That's what I was. That's what I was trying to say.
I'm not sure about that. Drives become, instincts become drives when they are worked over by the psyche.
But they're always already worked over by the psyche. At least that's how Freud's presenting it.
Drives.
We never have access. We never have access to instincts in themselves that aren't worked over by the psyche.
Drives.
Maybe it would be
when we think about the dead
good to think about the way that the object is incorporated into the ego as the primary stage, what Freud discussed. That's a structuration for Freud. And the autoerotism that he speaks about as originary is not a primary structure that is there in the beginning. What's there in the beginning is the mother and the child. So what hate is discussed in this paper, it's the stage where it's a really difficult thing, and I struggle to understand what's happening when the object is incorporated into the ego for Freud. What happens there at that point? It's a point where hate and love are once again one and the same.
I think, Carol, you want to say something?
No, go for it.
Okay. I think we have this question of ambivalence of feeling, which you're rightly describing, that love and hate, in the Freudian thinking, hate becomes that stepping back from the world, and love becomes directly encountering the world. And that ambivalence always exists because your ego is capable of bringing the object of the world back into your ego, in that sense. And that ambivalence is at the origin of the display of instincts and ego in many ways, which we can have a longer discussion about how that takes place. But about this question of autoeroticism and drives in that sense, I think one way to think about it would be that drives are the primary thing. At the very source itself, drives are autoerotic. And as they come into the circus, that curvature, as Eric was talking about, this question of this movement into desire, from drive to desire, as it gets embroiled into that excess of object, or however you want to call it, it is at that point something like ego becomes important to emerge. Ego doesn't, as Freud said in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, ego is that top surface which actually is regulating your relationship with your environment in that sense.
But if we here are not this ambiguating between instinct and drive, then I would say that, yeah, drives are not for Freud at the start autoerotic.
If you are not making that distinction, you're saying.
I think the way Freud uses the term instinct is what we call drive, because what happens is that in this battle for the word instinct, I think that basically the discipline of biology or the discipline of physiology is primarily what we associate with the concept of instinct. And then in order to really claim the concept that Freud is talking about in this paper, we just end up using the word drive. And that, at least how I understand it, is that the drive is autoerotic from the first.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing, since the translations that have given to these papers, they're really doing a bad job in here, this instance. It's a really common and well-known thing that what Freud is discussing here is Trieb and Trieb-Schicksal, which is translated as, I think, very poorly as vicissitudes, since one could also speak about fates of drives, and that would really be more in keeping with Freud's tendencies or his connotations that he has to even Greek drama and so on, as some have argued.
Yeah, I think it should be stated outright, and we really kind of jumped into all this without making it clear that German has two words. It does have a word, instinct, and that is what Freud uses when he talks about animal instinct. And then there is a Trieb, which Trieb is directly cognate with our English drive. All you have to do is vocalize the initial dental consonant and change the vowel, and then fricativize the labial. So it's the directly cognate. So I think drive is a more proper way of speaking about this. And if Freud wants to talk about actual instinct, then he can use that other word, instinct, which is borrowed from Latin or something. And yeah, and it's interesting also in regard to the term Schicksal, Lacan even he even says that it could be thought of in terms of adventure, which I think is interesting, which that I think has an even more Hegelian valence.
Just in the interest of making sure everyone gets to talk, Alexandra, would you like to jump in?
Yes, thank you. I have some questions to you. I think, hello, you hear me?
To me?
To all of you.
Okay.
It's okay if you want to I start first with you. So what Evren said is so interesting. This idea he suggested, that das Ding, the thing, is jouissance. I appreciate very much this idea. That, as I understand, Evren suggested that das Ding is jouissance on a pre-symbolic level. When the baby is just a baby and he has not yet a symbolic language, he is on a perceptual level. And from this point of view, I will jump with a comparison between Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, and Lacan. There is such an interesting difference. They are similar till a point, but then the difference is manifest. In which sense? In the sense that Jean-Paul Sartre is approaching to the gaze of the other as being something that he is not able to accept, something that makes him feel shame, something that makes him reject this gaze, this object of the gaze. He's afraid. He can't accept it. He just refuses the gaze of the other. While Lacan goes further and describes that this gaze of the other that becomes the object of the scopic drive in Lacan's theory of drives, this gaze of the other, which is firstly the gaze of the other. Other means mother. This gaze is accepted and is confirming the child. So Lacan brings the other perspective, not of rejecting the gaze of the other, with big other, with mother, with whatever kind of other you prefer, but is embracing and becomes the I, becomes the ego because of the other, because of the mother. And that's das Ding. That's the jouissance, a pre-symbolic Ding, jouissance. Okay, and now I will go to the third one because you said it's an important one, and I mentioned his name, René Girard. René Girard is describing very clear that there is always a mimetic mechanism before this ego, before this Freudian narcissism, primal narcissism. There is no narcissism, there is no ego, there is the other. And René Girard describes very well that first there is the other. And this, the other, who is first before the narcissistic ego, and here René Girard is going farther than Freud. Freud is talking in this ego, in this theory of narcissism and primary narcissism. But René Girard is saying that you can't become an I till you are not imitating somebody else. And this is this triangle. He has a whole theory about this mimesis. And he is using the concept interdivviduality. There is no individuality. This is imaginary. This is the mirror stage, the Lacanian mirror stage. I imagine that I am an individual. No, I am an interdivvidual. That's the concept of René Girard. Line, individual. And here jumps Chetan with his brilliant question. Everything is reduced on the relation between interior and exterior. What's that? Are they twinned, intertwined, interlinked? Are we in dualism or non-dualism? So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
So Freud is stuck in ego.
Now, Freud has a chance because he said Bejahung. So
yeah,
because of this Bejahung,
Bejahung,
this means that the child is confirmed by the gaze of the mother. So he has the chance to become somebody, to become an ego, because he accepts. Bejahung means accepting the other. If you refuse the other, then you are stuck in your ego and you have no chance to develop an intersubjectivity. That's my opinion. And about this autoerotism, that's not something bad, autoerotism, but what means autoerotism? First, as is the other erotism, because it's the pleasure of being, it's the pleasure that somebody looks at you, as in not voyeurism, the other one, exhibitionism. And that's the root of exhibitionism, the pleasure of that somebody looks at you as and confirms you as a subject, as something. So I think when you say autoerotism and heteroerotism is again this question of Chetan. What's auto and what's hetero? Interior, exterior, subject, world. Is this a dual division? Let's go to non-duality, or trying to do this. I don't know.
But
So,
to me, it sounds that you're not reading Freud in the way that Lacan reads Freud. Since
of course,
Freud,
I'm
can I explain, please, what I mean?
I'm a singularity, because everyone is singularity, and everyone has his right to read in his singular style. Of course,
individualism and everything. But yeah, can I just explain why I say that? I think that what Freud gives, and this is what Lacan emphasizes from first seminar on, was that what Freud gives is the separation of the subject and the ego. And in this way, Freud isn't stuck in the ego.
No. Okay.
And what Lacan gives, on the other hand, is the idea of the big other, and the possibility that this big other, which really is the primary mother, and can be a devouring relationship, and the way that the subject can try and disambiguate him or herself from this mortifying ideal is perhaps even self-destructive in some way. And
Mika,
Lacan identifies this big other of the mother as the superego. It's a really neat way, but the way that you explain jouissance, to me it sounds that you need to argue against Daria Leader here, because he's saying that this way of conceptual jouissance, it doesn't help anybody anyway.
Now, I was trying to say that even if Freud is a pioneer, and even if he is brilliant and he is developing a whole way of treating symptoms and understanding the nature of human mind and soul and body and unicity of the symptom, there are others who bring something and who are developing his theory. And I am thinking to René Girard and to Lacan, because I didn't read Hegel. But in my opinion, René Girard is bringing this extraordinary idea that there is something that in order to be somebody, first you are the other. You have to mimic somebody. You have to, there is this, mimicry, this...
mimesis.
Mimesis. I don't know so well English to be able to describe this, but there is this resonance, this imitation, this mimesis, this between something and something that we all the time through dialectics, we are separating it. We are making this division. And then Lacan is bringing and explaining this mimesis through this mirroring stage in a way, and creates this imaginary so-called register. But I agree with what Evren said, that jouissance is das Ding, and you can accept or reject it.
I just want to say here for perhaps if there are viewers that are confused in all this, I'm in extensive dialogue right now with a Girardian about the relationship between Girard and Freud, and I just want to read the latest dialogue between him and I. He said, Freud did all the groundwork and the basic observations: primordial murder, lying at the basis of society, triangles of desire, Oedipus as the basis of neurosis. Girard simply tied it together in a coherent speculative system. Girard is not anti-Freud, au contraire. Speculative anthropology starting with Freud and going through Girard, end quote. So again, I think it's
I
really
agree. I
important.
agree totally.
Okay, Alexandra. But I think that it's really important to emphasize that if we explore basically a speculative anthropology in Girard, that does not mean that we have to become ourselves dualistic and binary by setting them up as opposites. I don't think they are. I think we have a psychoanalysis with Freud, and I think we have the attempt towards an anthropology with Girard, and I don't know what to make of it, but I don't think we need to put them as opposites.
If you want, there's a very interesting chapter of Violence in the Sacred, chapter 7, which actually does what Cadell is saying. It's a very interesting chapter which Girard himself has written in his Violence in the Sacred on Freud, and he's sort of having that very interesting conversation between this question of mimesis and the Oedipus complex of Freud. Although if you think about mimesis in a lot of ways already there in repetition. It's not like Freud can't think repetition in that sense. So that's something we need to be, what Girard is actually bringing into that story, we need to be much more conscious of that question. I've not read Girard in a long time, to be honest. I used to read him way back when I hadn't read Freud properly. So for me, these two thinkers, it's interesting to bring them together. Thanks. I would have to go back and read it.
I think what's at least what I see is what is forcing Girard into the conversation seriously is this emphasis on violence. And that there's a primordial violence at the core of our imagination and our symbolism, and even the way we speak to each other. And like the thing that I'm getting a lot when talking to a Girardian is I'm forced to reflect more and more on the violence in common discourse. And it really feels like a paradoxical trap. I don't know how to escape it, but it's about this aggressive. It's about these aggressive impulses, like the desire to kill. And I was thinking more about the eat, eat, like, so if we talk about Das Ding as the mother, like eating, fucking, or killing, it's like eating has the least prohibitions around it, because if you're eating, you just need to go to the grocery store and get some food. Having sex has more prohibitions around it because you have the potentiality to harm the other. There's all more emotional complications around it. Killing has the most prohibitions around it because we can't go around killing each other. But for that reason, it's the most repressed, I would say. And maybe it comes out in other forms in our speech.
The way I am hearing all of this is though that, well, Lacan speaks about imaginary aggressivity, and he has the whole paper on aggression with psychoanalysis, and the way that Lacan bases his own theory in Freud, it's really ingenious, and Freud gives some kind of a fine structuration that goes on in really early stages, which has an account of how hate comes about, which I tried to explain, and I don't think it's going much further than that in here, and develops later into death drive and everything. And the way that I hear some people coming with Girard is that they just give a nice mash of word salads and pretend that it's giving a much more comprehensive explanation of everything. But basically what I hear is that big ideas tossed around, and they have somehow capture all this fine structuration that Freud gives, and which Lacan elaborates with his 3 registers, which is really fine and everything, but then I don't hear anything that would be much more clarificatory from Girardians. And I have heard some people say that Girard is more logical, but basically I have not seen so far anything that would be more logical than what I find in Lacan already. Freud.
One way to articulate that distinction, and I've not read Girard in a long time. I'm just maybe faffing from my memory in some senses, but take it as it is. One way to think that distinction is that Girard lies more on the side of identification, whereas Freud lies more on the side of libido, in that sense, sexuality, or whatsoever, sexual drive, whatever you want to call it in that sense. The distinction that Girard makes between ego instincts and, this question of the child identifies with the father and he finds a sexual satisfaction with the mother, and Girard's thinking is that question of identification is primal in some senses.
Yeah, and here I would say that it's blurring the boundaries again, since Freud has a whole topic of identification and the object relation, and he doesn't mash this together, but he discusses them.
Which is why the discussion should not be Freud against Girard, which is why I don't want to go there, that, we are saying Freud against Girard. We need to think with the thinkers rather than against them. Against thinking is boring in many ways. I enjoy thinking with the thinker, accept his assumptions and see where it goes, and what is he giving me essentially. So I think one distinction is that Girard has an emphasis upon this question of identification, of course, which is what Mimes essentially is a problem for him, that he thinks that desire at its very root is identificatory. In that sense, it's mimetic, that you desire what the other person desires. In that sense, question of violence becomes primal for him. My own thesis was on violence, so that is where I encountered him in that sense, and which is why he thinks that you need sacred boundaries to navigate that violence. And this question of modern law actually becomes important from that lens.
And that's his theory of religion, right? Like the sacred boundaries are basically what we call religion, and it's to basically to constrain violence from getting out of control.
Yeah. So if you constrain the mimesis, that question of identification, in that sense, that is very primal in the Girardian thinking. So if you want to think Girard with Freud, which is very important, I think what we need to uncover, which I've been saying, I think last time also, that how do we think through identification in Freud? That's a difficult question. I don't think that's something that is already answered for us. I don't think we can take it for granted in that sense. That to that degree, Girard brings something new to the table that we can think. In Freud, we have a very, very nice way to think about this question of when you use another object. You do not have a very good way to think about when you want to be like another object so that you can find that satisfaction and so on and so forth. That how do we think through that question in Freud? I think that is what Girard opens up for us as people who are reading Freud seriously, and
and another sorry, go ahead, Mika.
It's, I think, displayed so many times that, well, Freud does discuss these things, and he has an account of these things which I find much more satisfying than what I have found so far from people discussing Girard, since I find their notions so vague. So sometimes what Freud discussed, for example, as a moral masochism, or the mysterious masochistic trend of the ego and everything. I mean, he's expanding on his vast evidence that he finds in listening to neurotics. And he, as we see in this paper, Freud's investigations are really thinking with the pen. He's all the time working with some really difficult issue, and he doesn't develop concepts if they don't help him in his aim in the clinic. And I think that Freud has this tendency of turning his notions around, because it helps him to grapple with the real that he finds in the clinic. And he also sharpens his notions more than he blurs them.
I am just making a minimal claim that question of identification is a genuine problem in Freud, which we need to think more about today in that sense. It's a relevant question for us in our times. It's something which needs to be thought through more, developed more in Freud. It hasn't been done so. Even in Lacan, it hasn't been done to the degree it needs to be developed in that sense. Yeah, Edel, please go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say the twofold is that I haven't read Girard in terms of the primary literature, so I'm hesitant to make strong statements about it. Although I think it's interesting that Girard has become so popular so quickly, and it's becoming kind of like a meme. It's catching fire, and is that because we're dealing with a type of scapegoating and a type of social violence in our society right now, which in need of an explanation of some kind, and people are grabbing for explanations because people are, I mean, in my family, I've dealt with scapegoating in the last year and a half. It's happening in my family. So, and then the other thing that's interesting to me is the question for me is, in psychoanalysis, there's this big split between Freud and Jung, which seems to have to do with religion, because Freud seems to be against religion in some sense, and Jung seems to try to revive religion through going to pre-psychoanalytic mysticism. And then Girard is approaching religion through violence and the killing of the primordial father. And what I've seen in Jungian communities built around mysticism is that they don't really understand violence. So I just wonder here if there's a conversation to be had about religion and violence, which is of relevance to Freud's theories of religion. I'm not sure.
I agree. The question of sacred has become very important today. There's no denying that. That it's not just religion. How do we think through the question of sacred in the human psyche? That's a very important question. If you want, I can quote one paragraph from Girard's work. I just found it. Can I quote it? Alexander, Alexander, you want to say something before? Alexander, you want to say something before?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Chetan. Just very shortly. In my opinion, the most important thing is not to let division operate, because they are saying very similar things, all of them, about violence, about identity, but so it's such a similarity between them, and they work together in this idea of discovering and understanding more about human nature. So there is no conflict here in there. But the very important thing, in my opinion, is to understand, and now I'm talking as a physician, to understand that Freud and Lacan were physicians. There are philosophers, and this René Girard, he was a professor, a teacher of literature. So there are very different backgrounds from where they are coming from. And I can't say a lot about philosophers. What I know is that they like so much dialectics, and they like so much analytical philosophy and logics and generalizing. But what I know surely about physicians is that they approach all the time the singularity of the symptom. And that was the most important thing for Lacan as well for Freud, the singularity of the symptom, and then generalizing. And I think we should take a meta position and analyze and compare, but not in a dialectic way, yes, no, but just similarities, to look for similarities and to understand that these differences come from the fact that they are coming from different professional backgrounds. That's very important, I think.
Let's think as a rhizome.
Yeah.
What's a meta position?
When you are not identified with something and you take a distance toward that thing in order to see better and to understand better what's about.
So no commitment to anything.
Just a little commitment.
Just a little commitment.
I think what
I'm absolutely against all of that.
Okay, I think okay, Chetan, did you? I don't want to take time away from what you were going to read from the primary literature.
I'm a very bad reader, so just pardon my bad. Yeah, so he just writes this, and this is chapter 7 of Freud and the Oedipus complex of violence in the sacred, Girard's work. Although traces of the mimetic conception are scattered through Freud's work, this conception never assumes a dominant role. It runs counter to Freudian insistence on desire that is fundamentally directed toward an object, that is sexual desire for the mother. When the tension between these opposing tendencies becomes too great, both Freud and his disciples seem to resolve it in favor of the object desire. The mimetic intuition of Freud gives rise to a series of concepts ambiguous in definition, obscure in status, and vague in function. Among the offshoots of this ill-defined mimetic desire are certain concepts that come under the heading identification. And he goes on to explain that from group psychology and so on and so forth. So I think we can very clearly see what Freud, what Lacan, what Girard is actually, trying to think through in Freud. And let's see if Freud can actually respond to this problem of identification in any coherent way as we read Freud further, and where do we need to take Freud to respond to that challenge. That is where Girard, I think, would become relevant for us. Can Girard add to that some coherence to that story of identification or
not? Maybe some note on at least how I understand this taking a meta position is that, at least from what I actually did just read a paper on Girard, and the idea here is that, at least for Girard, there is no meta position where you can get out of violence. It's like when you try to take a meta position, you're trying to get out of violence, but there is no position from where you can do that. That even the meta position, and that's what I understand about like all the meta modern people and like sort of bourgeois intellectual culture, is that they take a meta position because they want to hide the fact that they are violent, and that the meta position is itself an obfuscation of violence. So and it's like this, always searching for this balanced neutrality, if that makes sense.
And in this sense, it is a notion of ideology proper here. It's pure ideology. Pure ideology is this place where one supposedly is neutral. It's never neutral.
Yeah.
Yes,
Go ahead, Alexandra.
It's not neutral. And indeed, what you said, I understand. But what about the fact that you are not projecting this unconscious violence of you on the other, but you have the insight that you are a violent person, and that is a lot. So you are not projecting on somebody else, transforming that person in a scapegoat, but you become aware and have the insight, oh, I have a violent drive in myself. What to do with it? I am a violent person. What should I do with my violence?
Yes.
That is, from my opinion,
yes,
a step. It is something, having this insight, what we said. That's the insight.
I agree.
So instead of turning towards love objects, one should turn towards some type of narcissism where one, instead of beating another, one beats one's own ego. So it's this moral masochism.
See, actually, I think if you think about violence physically, what happened?
No, I'm laughing at the insanity in my head.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, we can. If you think about violence in that sense, I think violence is already there centrally in Freud also. There is no denying that in that sense. And he rightly said violence is a question of responsibility at some senses. When Zizek says that in what senses Gandhi is more violent than Hitler, he does not mean, this is the exact quote from Zizek. And he does not mean that Gandhi actually went and fought.
I know, yeah.
Fought with everybody and so on, so it killed many people. What he means is this question that Hitler's problem with his own violence was not that he was less violent, in the sense that he never could take responsibility for his own violence. He could never be held accountable for it. He could never be, go to the end of his own violence in that sense. In many ways, he was less violent than he should have been. He should, Gandhi was somebody who could completely go to the end of that violence. He could completely affirm his own violence. And that is where this question of non-violence comes into picture. Non-violence is not absence of violence. Absence of violence is simple, some kind of utopian dream. Non-violence is a particular way to engage with violence. As Walter Benjamin very rightly says, only non-violence that exists is a form of relationship that doesn't end in a contract. That's the only point you can seek in non-violence. When you have an engagement with another, that never ends in a contract, that never sort of find its end in a contractual obligation in some sense. And that is where I think we come full circle and we come back to the problem of other. That in what way does our engagement with the other actually negotiated through contracts in some senses, vis-a-vis this problem of ego. And that is where I think Jyoti's question becomes important of the active and passive. I wanted to say something on it, but I think we'll go into another discussion. But the simpler way to, I think very easy way to think about it would be that drives are active when there is a passive voice of the subject. There's an inverse relationship between active drive and passivity of the subject. I think Lacan also gets that when he says that the new subject emerges when drive becomes passive. When your drive from going from active to reflexive to passivity. When that whole cycle gets completed, it is at that point that your activity of the drive becomes possible in that sense. That is at that point that you can actually enter into a relationship with the other, which is not mediated through this ego ideal and in that very concrete, if I may say so. That's a question that we need to think about. That we think about active passive simply in binaries. They're not simple binaries in that sense. A lot of times truly to be active means a passive subjectivity in that sense.
Fascinating. Okay. I think maybe we should approach wrapping up. I would still like to open if anyone wants or anyone has anything else to say, either on the paper or on this recent conversations about violence and Freud and Girard. I would say that one of the things I've appreciated in talking to a Girardian recently was this claim that a lot of philosophy is naive about the reality of human nature or the reality of the human mind. And I don't think that's true necessarily in Hegel, but it might be true about a lot of philosophers. And I think that's maybe at the core of why Freud is so interesting for philosophy today. Because if anyone really investigated like the reality of the human mind and our violence and our mess, I mean, it's him. So it makes sense that he's becoming philosophically useful. And I don't know, maybe that's true for Girard as well, but I might want to dive into one of his big books.
Just today I was listening to a recent podcast from Joe Rogan, since apparently he's now talking to philosophers also, and there was this guy talking about panpsychism as the ultimate like ground or foundation of like everything. It's as if he lives in a world in which there is nothing pertaining to sexuality, nothing relating to violence. No. It's all just consciousness. When they say that consciousness, that's when I usually turn the whole thing off and go do something useful. But yeah, like the consciousness is the catch term, which you need to avoid when philosophers begin. And yeah,
it's like people, like there's philosophers making a career out of, well, there's materialism and we don't want to be materialists anymore, so why don't we just switch to idealism and everything's the mind.
It's an explanation. Yeah, they're always explaining. And when you look at where philosophy starts, I mean, look at what's a Socratic dialogue. It's not this fucking expert telling you what your mind is, like this fucking panpsychist. He's just telling everybody what the things are in the true nature of things. Or it's a fucking ridiculous exercise, mental masturbation. But when you look at what philosophy is from the start, from Socratic dialogues, it's just this perpetual wonder. I mean, it's encountering in a dialogue something really like gripping. It's almost like an opening of an other dimension or something, which of course Plato like inhabited with these forms and everything. Yeah,
it's a brilliant end. I don't want to add anything to that.
Thank you.
I appreciate the destruction of the panpsychist. That's where we should direct our violence. And then let's make the panpsychist the scapegoat. Let's get them out of here.
I don't know. I don't want to be too hard. It's good.
Okay.
It's all right, since philosophy is this kind of like process always. When you are wrestling with philosophy, it's like going into the mud with the pigs. I mean, at some point you're going to realize that they really enjoy doing it.
Alexander, did you want to end with?
Yes.
Yes.
I appreciate so much, Kader, that you are talking at first person and that you are giving examples from your life. I want to give you an example from my life and to finish with a question. And it's something that that's very important to me. So the grandmother, no, the grandmother, the mother of my grandmother who raised me up, yes, she died from complication at birth. So she died after 2 weeks after giving birth. So the two little daughters were raised up by their father, and these two daughters could not remember very well their mother. So how should I deal with this symptom of mine? On one side, I would not be myself as I am, as I know myself, because I am as I know myself because of this genetics of my family. But in the same time, because of this giving birth of my grandmother, she died. So it's an example in my personal life of death and birth intertwined together. And I'm so ambivalent. So that's an example of violence, of hate and love in a way. I hate myself because of myself in a way and of my ancestors. This woman died, but on the other side, I have to love myself and my mother and my grandmother. So it's you understand my question?
I understand your story. I'm not sure if I have an answer, but I appreciate you sharing it.
Do you know what I would picture? I mean, I'm not an analyst in any way, but the way I would picture a psychoanalyst, a Lacanian psychoanalyst, would say here is, okay, let's end here. See you next time.
Thank you. You're the best analyst, Mika.
Disagree. Yeah.
Okay, guys. So I'm gonna just wrap up for the viewers that we covered instincts and their vicissitudes from 1915. Really talking about how the way instincts are always mediated by psychological representations, that these psychological representations undergo transformations related to the relationship between, according to Freud, go through transformations related to the relationship between ego and the world, activity and passivity, pleasure and unpleasure. And then we had a long conversation that winded around on many different topics, mostly related to philosophy and psychoanalysis, but then also related to Girard and violence and the place of violence in psychoanalysis and specifically Freud. So I'd like to thank all of you guys for that. And if you're still watching this, thank you to you as well. And I will see you hopefully in the next workshop. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kadil.